I'm very humbled and honored that you've invited me, Stefan, because as my title says, I'm going to go straight against many of the beliefs that seem to be very prevalent in the kind of research that you all do on proto-lang. So I'm really, really grateful that you invited me to challenge your beliefs, because my plan is to go really meta on proto-lang related research. And my goal is to raise a global question about one aspect that seems so central to research on language evolution, the aspect that enlists evidence from Creole languages as, quote, observable windows on the earliest stages of language evolution in the species. In raising these meta questions about the epistemology and sociology of research in your field, evolution of language, I'll be linking that research to world history, especially to the history of colonialism and white supremacy, and also critical race theory and matters of social justice that deeply matter to me personally. So when one looks at the history of linguistics, like that of anthropology, we see that linguistics, in effect, runs the risk of cementing white supremacy and other forms of social inequities and racial violence. Indeed, even as we produce knowledge and resources about or for disenfranchised communities, typically Black and brown people in the global South, often we also turn these individuals into the primitive, savage other that needs to be rescued or silenced in various ways. So actually, this is the title of a key paper by my late colleague, Asian anthropologist Michel DeGraff. And I think that much in the research on language evolution, through what I consider the misuse of Creole languages, also practices what Trouillot was warning against in anthropology, meaning the politics of otherness. So to look at an example close to the proto-lang home, to your home, let's sample a relatively recent handbook on language evolution. Remarkably, toward the beginning of that handbook by Maggie Tallerman and Kathleen Gibson, we are warned explicitly about, quote, the danger of confusing ontogenetic versus phylogenetic processes. The editors explain that, quote, there is no reason to think that any specific evidence concerning the origins of language can be gained from studying the acquisition of modern languages. Okay, so keep that in mind as we move now to the next slide. In the next slide, which is the next paragraph of that handbook, they mention linguists' use of Pidgin and Creole data as, quote, observable language genesis, which can in turn serve as evidence for the study of the origins of language. Now, am I the only one here to notice a potential deep contradiction between these two paragraphs, the one here and this one right before? Now, throughout the book, especially in part 5 on language change, creation, and transmission in modern humans, we keep encountering this heuristic of using Pidgin and Creole data as, quote, observable windows on the origins of human language. As you can see on this slide, it's even stressed that it's plausible, quote, that language change in recorded history and the present day may offer evidence for the evolution of the earliest pre-languages. And the next quote goes straight into claims that I've addressed in my critique of Creole Exceptionalism. Now, in terms of history of thoughts, I've started publishing against Creole Exceptionalism since 2003 in the journal Language. Yet the handbook published in 2012 makes no reference at all to my critique, which I find to be actually quite stunning in terms of intellectual history. Now, what you see on this slide are alleged structural reflexes of Creole Exceptionalism scenarios. One claim is that Creole show less subordination, meaning less recursion. Creole is supposed to show utmost simplicity, again, less subordination, and allege prototypical features. And the next claim is that Creole is supposed to show invention, or what Bacon calls more colorfully, ab ovo creation, creation from the egg. And actually, what's interesting here is that Creoles are put in the same class as invented as new sign languages. But here, actually, one can argue pretty straightforwardly that the sociolinguistic environment, the ecology for the creation of new sign languages and for the formation of Creole languages are drastically different. I mean, if one just look at history, look at Nicaragua, where you have observed creation of sign languages, and you look at the history of Haiti, clearly the ecology was drastically different due to modality, because in the case of Nicaragua, the new signers weren't exposed to any pre-existing language. In the case of Haiti, the creator of Haitian Creole were surrounded by fully fledged human languages from Europe and from Africa. So it's striking that the two would be put on a par. And that could be another talk, some of which you can find in the conclusion of my own edited volume on language change and creation, where we do look at similarities and dissimilarities between sign language emergence and Creole formation. Now, going back to language evolution, the entire handbook on language evolution, edited by Tallerman and Gibson, in that entire handbook, there is only what I perceive to be one somewhat dissenting voice. The assessment section in Paul Robert's chapter, where he does say that there is a distancing between linguistic theory and the view that Creole formation would have required special creation by children. So this is the most I could find in terms of a dissenting note in the view that Creole and Pidgin data are observable windows on language evolution of the earliest pre-languages. So by and large, the contributions in the handbook seem to accept Bickerton's views about Creole languages arising from pidgins, and therefore Creole languages being a reflex of innate and evolutionary primitive syntactic patterns. For example, Bickerton suggests that the processes for marking closal and phrasal boundaries are lacking in Creole languages. Why? Because ways of determining phrase boundaries may have been a very late or even the final property of syntax to emerge. And again, there is no need to go into the details of the disproof. As a speaker of Haitian Creole, I can tell you that this is not true. Because of time, we won't get into the details. Now, my claim is that such assumptions, such heuristics on the part of researchers on proto-lang are part and parcel of what I've called Creole Exceptionalism, which I also call, as in the title, linguists' most dangerous myth. So here you'll see the abstract of that paper, which was published in 2005, which is also a preview of my lecture, in case I run out of time. But this is the abstract of the paper, which advertises the preview of my talk. So basically, what I'm going to show is that Creole Exceptionalism is really a set of beliefs whereby Creole languages form this exceptional class on phylogenetic or typological grounds. And what will also concern me here, and that will be the latter part of this talk, is an issue that has affected me personally, along with millions of Haitian children and other speakers of Creole languages, generations after generations, for the past 2 centuries. Namely, the claim that Creole languages are a handicap for the speakers. So this claim really, and I can prove it to you, has undermined the role that Creole languages should play in the education and the socioeconomic development of Creole speakers. These are not just academic matters for me. What I also hope to argue in this talk is that these beliefs of Creole exceptionalism, they constitute a regime of truth in the sense of Michel Foucault. And as such, this regime of truth actually obstructs scientific and social progress in and about Creole languages and their speakers. So here, of course, I will focus on my native Haiti as a case study. And in doing so, in this talk, I will try my hardest in the short time to deconstruct the sort of beliefs that seem so prevalent in research on language evolution, in our linguistic textbooks, and in many corners of our field. What I will also show is that these beliefs are rooted in the colonial past, or to put it bluntly, in white supremacy writ large. Let's start by some history. So here we're going to trace the intellectual history of white supremacy and how it has colonized linguistics and also education. My argument here is that linguistics, alongside actually including research and education, and actually even outside of linguistics, even if you look at human rights work by, say, UNESCO or the World Bank's, so linguistics has been weaponized to create arbitrary, what Frederick Douglass called, actually also Schleicher called, actually both of them use the same term, grades of humanity that keep racialized or minoritized groups at the bottom of various hierarchies of wealth and power. And this sort of white supremacy in linguistics, especially in Creole studies, started very early in the history of the field. So these quotes that you're going to see now, I think they amount to one most explicit program of anti-Black, racist colonial linguistics. And this is only a small sampling of what I've called Creole Exceptionalism. And as you'll see, many of these quotes that you're going to see now, they are from research publications, and they've made it in the popular press, in popular consciousness. Even worse, perhaps, and I'll show that to you as well, these claims have also entered into the consciousness of Creole speakers like myself when I was a child, including teachers, parents, policymakers, and all kinds of intellectuals. So the point is that linguistics, especially Creole studies, has participated in anti-Black colonial campaigns against Creole languages and the speakers from the very beginning of Creole studies, which started as part of the colonial enterprise or the European mission civilisatrice in Africa and the Americas. So the first three quotes that you're going to see, they have one, well, if I can say beautiful advantage, if I can use the word beautiful in that context, in terms of critical race theory, because what they do, those quotes from the 19th century, they make an explicit link between linguistic theoretical claims and racist views about the racialized groups that were key actors in Creole formation. So let's look at quote one. So quote one, actually we can call that quote an example of normal, back then this was normal science, normal cognitive science for colonial linguists. So the claim here is that Creoles were created to ease the intelligence of those with limited capacities, right? So this is a quote in one from a Creolist called Saint-Quentin. Now, if you look at quote two, it makes clear reference to people considered primitive. So basically, primitive languages for primitive people. Now, quote three speaks explicitly about a race that is linguistically inferior. So you can see here, clear mention of race. And this is the sort of research that started Creole studies. Now, if we move to the 20th and 21st centuries, what do we find? So the quote in one is perhaps the most spectacular that many of you would have encountered. What is meant here, in effect, I like to say that in every talk I give, is that when I myself, as a Creole speaker, when I switch from speaking English to speaking Creole, I automatically become a fossil of humanity. So this is actually pretty serious as a claim. And it's a spectacular claim. And with little basis in reality, if we accept that I myself, Michel DeGraff, do belong to modern Homo sapiens, and that my brain cannot be at once modern when I speak English and become ancient and primitive and a fossil when I speak Creole. Yet this claim has been widely quoted. We find it even in the New York Times, thanks to contemporary Creolists like John McWhorter, who claim that Creole languages are the only languages that have started again, which is a direct echo of Bickerton's colonial program for Creole languages. Remember ab ovo creation? So McWhorter is just a copycat of Bickerton, nothing original here. In quote three, Creole is called broken French. This is in the popular media outlet. Now, if we take language to be a reflex of mental properties, it means that Creole-speaking brains are somehow a broken version of French-speaking brains, right? Now, remember these claims, actually, because what you're going to see in the latter part of the talk is how these claims about Creoles being broken, primitive, etc., how they have affected actual policy making in the case of Haiti in terms of education. lastly, in Code 4, this is from the New Yorker, very fancy, highbrow magazine in the US. It calls Creole a guttural French patois, guttural French patois. So all these claims have been demystified in my work, and you can find my papers on my MIT website, but there's no time to go into each of them separately. So now what I want to do is to look at textbooks themselves and see how they've entrenched these myths about Creole languages, especially the myth that Creoles emerged from pidgins. For example, this is from the classic textbook by O'Grady et al. What does it say? The idea is that at the onset of language contact between speakers of different languages, you have a pidgin, that's a contact language with very reduced structures and with what Bickerton called a macaronic vocabulary. Actually, by the way, macaronic is a technical term from Bickerton. It's like macaroni with a mix of different strains of different languages. And then the children of pidgin speakers, as they learn the pidgin, they turn it into a Creole, which is a full language, but still one that's created ab ovo, from the egg. So that's how Creole languages are viewed as totally new languages that are supposed to tell us how the very first human language would have emerged in the history of Homo sapiens, right? So most textbooks basically present that scenario as if it's a truism. Luckily, there is hope. When we look at more recent textbooks by younger scholars, such as my friend here, Viveka Velupillai. And what Viveka does very nicely in the textbook, which I recommend to most of you or all of you who would like to question the assumptions, she talks about two basic flaws in this type of scenarios a la Bickerton. First of all, so-called Creole features are found in languages that are not usually labeled as Creoles. And second of all, many Creoles do not conform to the Creole prototype. And Viveka also stresses the fact that those claims about Creole prototypes are really circular. A point that's also been made by Dow. A case in point here that I'll come back to, Haitian Creole. So when I first published a paper about Haitian Creole showing that it was not conforming to McWhorter's prototype schemas, he says, well, maybe Haitian Creole is not so much of a Creole. So basically, he also sees that even those linguists like McWhorter that cherry pick the data in order to defend this pidgin to Creole scenario, they end up by either contradicting themselves or they make the class of relevant Creole languages a moving target that's becoming narrower and narrower. For example, when I show that Haitian Creole contradicts this scenario, then poof, Haitian Creole goes from being a most Creole of Creole, that was 1992 in McWhorter's language paper, and now it's become a most decreolized Creole. Why? Because as the argument goes, Haitian Creole has evolved in a quote-unquote diglossic environment. But what do we see in our archival data? Well, what we see is that Haitian Creole was already a challenge, that scenario, at the very onset of its history. As soon as we can find documentation about Haitian Creole, we see a variety of data that contradict the Creole prototype scenarios. And it's a bizarre claim to say that it's language contact, meaning a diglossic situation, that's the reason why Haitian Creole no longer fits the Creole scenario, because language contact is what triggered the very formation of Creole languages, right? So now to say that it's language contact that's made Haitian Creole a decreolized Creole, actually you can see how contradictory and circular the argument is. But anyway, so Viveka does a good job in passing out this silliness, really. So now let's look at claims about Creole languages that have a direct impact on the actual lives of Creole speakers, because these claims, in effect, have the potential to block access to quality education for Creole speakers. Let's take, for example, French linguist Albert Vollmann, a very good linguist who's done lots of beautiful work on Haitian Creole. But what Vollmann claims is that it's the very nature of Creole languages, because they are supposed to be morphologically reduced with very little apparatus to express signs. That's what makes those languages difficult to use for education. And if you were to try to use them for education, like we're doing at MIT, then you would condemn these languages to what? To language death, because they'll have to borrow so much from European languages. As a consequence of these borrowings, they will, quote, dissolve. They will dissolve in so-called major languages. Now, this is a very serious concern, because if that were true, it would mean that efforts like those I'm engaged in at MIT with the MIT initiative, they would actually cause Haitian Creole to decreolize, meaning to die out. So this is colonial linguistics to an extreme degree, forcing Creole languages outside of classrooms because of the alleged structural poverty. Sadly enough, this myth of decreolization is one that is so widespread, even in Haiti, even by well-meaning linguists and educators who unfortunately have been brainwashed by colonial scholars. Like I myself used to be brainwashed as well to believe that Haitian Creole was a half French or a half language. Now, let's look at cases where anti-Blackness can be seen among the most preeminent Creole speakers themselves. So I'm going to share a series of quotes now where you can see a clear link between global geopolitical hegemony and internalized racism among Creole speakers themselves, who've been made to believe that Haitians who don't speak French are either subhumans, primitive, or they need to mentally evolve. So now again, I'm cherry picking my examples to illustrate the extent to which anti-Blackness, even among Haitian intellectuals, affect progress in Haiti. So the author on this slide is an anthropologist well known that I love a lot. His name is Firmin. Actually, October of last year was the 170th anniversary of Firmin's birth. And Margaret Thomas, archivist of the LSA, paid a tribute to Firmin, stressing that Firmin's legacy is on a par with that of Franz Boas. Now, what's striking here is that Firmin was a passionate militant against racism. He wrote a beautiful piece called On the Equality of Human Races. And his book was a powerful response to the racist treatise by French anthropologist Gobineau. Gobineau had a book called On the Inequality of Human Races. Yet Firmin, like many of his contemporaries and like many Haitians today, believe that Haitians need French in order to evolve mentally, which means that Haitians who speak only Creole, which is the majority, are not yet, quote unquote, mentally evolved, right? That's a serious claim. But in effect, it's a claim about the inequality of human races. So even though, as Firmin was fighting against Gobineau about equality of Black people, in effect, language being a proxy for racialized community, Firmin was arguing actually in favor of inequality through language, right? So now let's look at more of these quotes that show similar processes of self-colonization among Creole speakers. And here we're going to look at 20th century leaders, thinkers like Aimé Césaire. He wrote this beautiful discourse against colonialism, but Césaire also believed that his native language, the Creole of Martinique, was a handicap. He says it's unable to express abstract ideas. Quote 3 is from Enoch Trouillot, who believes that Creole has narrow structures. So this is Manigat, former president of Haiti, historian. He believed that Creole was a limitation, even worse yet, an infirmity, and due to its origin in what? A pidgin, right? Now you can see where linguistic claims converge with claims by non-linguists who have power on policy making. And again, I'm going to be clear, this sort of beliefs is what I myself grew up with. This is the air we breathe. Supremacy, privilege, hegemony, they work so well because they go unnoticed until you make the effort to be self-reflexive. Okay, so these beliefs, I had them for a good chunk of my own life. But the point here is that you can see the link between those beliefs and the kind of things that you find in linguistic textbooks, but also in the research that you guys do on language evolution. So now the key question is, are there any strictly linguistic traits that are found in the history and structures of Creole languages that are not found in the history and structures of any non-Creole languages? And I can tell you that the answer is a resounding no. And again, I'm going to recommend, for those of you who want to enter this debate, Viveka Vilupilai's textbook is a good place to do that because she has lots of references. Now you have to ask, why is it that it's still part of our lore, so to speak? It's cited all over the place. Creoles emerged from Pidgin, and worse yet, claims to the contrary are not even cited. So that handbook by Talleman and Gibson don't even cite work published in the general language that argue to the contrary, right? So there's a problem here. And more recently, there is work by Blasi, Michaelis, and Haspelmath that have robust results that support the fact that Creoles are basically like Romance languages. And I like to call the work big data against the big dogmas of Creole Exceptionalism. And what they've done is to carefully look at a whole range of patterns comparing Creole languages with non-Creole languages. And the result is very straightforward, which is that the grammars of Creole languages inherit aspects of the grammars of the languages that were in contact during Creole formation. So if so, there is no empirical reason to believe that Creoles as a whole would have been created ab ovo, quote unquote, from the egg out of pigeons, right? So these big data arguments very strongly argue against any pigeon to Creole scenario. And my friend Mufwene has shown us with some beautiful maps and beautiful comparisons that in terms of the development, Creole formation is really on a par with the history, say, of Romance languages. So let's look at the history of Romance languages very quickly and ask, how did Latin give rise to Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, French, etc.? Okay, and there are two key concepts here to keep in mind as you compare the history of Romance with that of, say, French lexicon Creoles like Haitian, Martinican, Seychellois, Mauritius, etc. Okay, so what Sally does very nicely, it looks at the history of Latin, how Latin speciated, to use a nice term from proto-language research, how Latin speciated into the Romance languages via migration and contact, and then now looking at French, how French speciated into Creoles like Haitian Creole, Martinican Creole, etc. And the point is that this is a very similar process, both in terms of history, in terms of sexual evolution. It's the same sort of patterns. And so what we have to conclude then is that a Creole language is a normal human language. So it's time to give up on these notions that Creole languages are supposed to be, quote unquote, observable windows for human language genesis, right? We have to give them up unless we go and tackle the data and make an argument why Creole languages would have emerged from pigeons. We have to do some, we have to stop being intellectually lazy and just accepting Bickerton's claim. We have to try to do the work that indeed we can prove this pigeon to Creole scenario. But actually, there are linguists like Peter Moiskin, for example, late Peter Moiskin, who passed away. He was my mentor when I was a student. Already in 1977, and this is many years ago, Peter Moiskin already said that those views on Creoles, like those that you find in the Tallerman and Gibson's book, they are shaped by the same racism that characterized slavery. That's Moiskin and Meyer back in 1977. And later on in 1988, Moiskin says, the very notion of Creole language linguistically disappears. What we have is just language. And now I have a recent paper with my friend Enoch Abo that I suggest that you read, where we talk about the need for a new theory of Creole formation, meaning that there is no need to posit any special theory to account for Creole formation only, as if it was a sui generis process, right? So whatever theory would account for, say, the history of Romance, it should also apply to the history of Creole languages. And that's what we have in this paper. Now, let's go back to my earlier question, which is that critical race theory. Why is it that for these 2 centuries, we keep repeating the same claims that Creoles are exceptional when the data to support these claims are so flimsy, right? So this map suggests that these claims about Creole languages are embedded in the very history of the triangular trade, where the Europeans' goal was to make Africans into lesser humans. And for that mission to succeed, the Europeans had to convince themselves first, and then the Africans that, because they were enlightened, right? Remember the Enlightenment? So of course, for the French to support slavery at the time of the French Revolution, they had to convince themselves that the Africans were lesser and they were being saved by slavery, right? So, and they had to believe that they spoke lesser languages, because remember back then, a la Humboldt, the language was the genius of nations. So lesser languages had to fit lesser humans. So basically the roots of the civilization of Creole languages is in this fateful triangular trade that triggered the very formation of Creole languages. So such use of language and linguistics for politics and for dehumanization is not at all peculiar to Creole studies, nor is it to your research on proto-lang. So now I'm going to show you examples of this use of language for colonizing Black and brown people throughout space and time. both in the history of colonization, but also in the history of linguistics. So I'm going to walk you through a set of examples with a variety of colonial languages. Nebrija for Spanish in 1492, Macaulay for English in India in the 19th century, and then we'll talk about Schleicher for linguistics in the latter half of the 19th century, and then we'll talk about the French in Francophone Africa and the Caribbean. So the point is to show you that to understand the persistence of these claims, you have to look at world history. You have to do critical race theory. So Nebrija, already in 1592, when the Spaniards were about to go to the conquest of Latin America, the Americas, Nebrija suggested to the Queen that Spanish would be a tool to cement the rule of the Spaniards on the New World. And as he said very eloquently, language is the concert of empire. Nebrija used a notion that, if we think of Black Lives Matter, what happened recently that triggered this global movement. Think of Nebrija telling the Queen Isabella that you have to place a yoke that's something that you put on someone's throat, actually animal's throat, but in this case, language, Spanish would be a yoke upon barbarians who speak outlandish tongues. We find similar discourse in India from the British. So there's this famous piece by Lord Macaulay, 1835, where he talked about the need to use English, you see, as an instrument of power, and to make Sanskrit look less valuable. In its logic, English is a language that has to be used to control the Indians, right? And notice that Macaulay here is using linguistics, right? You think that we can show that structurally English is more sophisticated than Sanskrit, without knowing that, in fact, if one were to compare the two structurally, one couldn't make a claim that English is so superior to Sanskrit. Now, what I want to point out is that this way of using language is also rooted in linguistics, because so Macaulay's and Nebrija clearly racist approach to Indo-European languages, they came in advance of the creation of this family tree model by Schleicher, right? Because if you look at this model here, which I wish I'd known about, I wish I had understood this history when I was a student, because this is about what Charity Hudley, Mallinson, and Buchholz called the repugnant history of linguistics. Now, the fact that this sort of linguistics is embedded in the history of white supremacy. Let's try to understand how this view of family trees came from a racist perspective on human quote-unquote races. This view assumes that languages pass through a life cycle that's quite similar to living beings. They start out simpler, and then they become more and more complex. So you have at first this primitive simplicity, which is followed by a period of growth. So now let's look at exactly what he writes here. He wants to apply Darwinian rules to languages. And why does he want to do that? He wants to do that because he believes that you can rank languages from less complex to more complex. And in doing so, in creating this classification, what you would do, you'd be able to categorize men into this hierarchy where simplest would be at the bottom, and more sophisticated, more complex would be at the top. So this was clearly a very racialist approach to the history of languages. Now, what I find when we look at history, like this of Haiti, it's interesting to see that Black people, even my own ancestors, so Jacques Dessalines is one of Haiti's founding fathers. So Dessalines and his army, they fought against the French in the 18th century already, and he kicked the French out of Haiti. And they got rid of slavery in Haiti. And he understood, even back then, the importance of language. So I like to say that Dessalines launched the Black Lives Matter movement before there were hashtags. And he very well understood the role of language in colonization and in neo-colonial hegemony, because he said very clearly here, this was in the 18th century, he was being observed by this Frenchman, and the Frenchman noticed that Dessalines would always insist that we have our own language, let's not use French, because Creole is really important to be proud of our language. Now, it took a couple of centuries before Haitian law implemented Dessalines' dream. So this is our Constitution. Article 5 declares that Creole is our sole national language. And our law since 87 makes Haitian Creole co-official with French. Unfortunately, and now you're going to see that right now, Creole, although on paper is official, but in practice, it's actually still being excluded. We have this proverb that says in Creole, Constitution c'est papier, that's fair, which means laws are made of paper, guns are made of steel. So what we'll survey now is the kind of neo-colonial guns that still work against this dream of Dessalines to make Creole a truly official language. And these guns, what I call these neo-colonial guns, diplomatic power or soft power, it can be traced to the white supremacy evidence in the myth of linguistics, including Creole studies. Okay, so let's see that. So now this is the French and the use of Francophonie in the 20th and 21st century. So what you see here, so this is the philosophy behind the movement to promote French in the Caribbean and Africa. And Giscard d'Estaing, which is a former French president in the 70s, he clearly explains what Francophonie is about. This notion of language as a tool for empire, it goes straight back to Nebrera in 1492, because Giscard d'Estaing explains that economic power often relies on cultural power. He talks about interdependence. And then he goes on to say that the vehicle of language is essential for economic dynamism on world markets. And then he concludes that that's why we need to promote Francophonie as a tool for political power. So just to give you an example here, I'm going to make you listen to recent dialogue between Jovenel Moïse, the late assassinated Haitian president. He was assassinated recently, and Emmanuel Macron, current French president. Now remember that in Haiti, we have two official languages, Creole and French. And Creole, by law, is the single national language. Now listen to this dialogue here between Macron, French president, and Moïse, Haitian president.
La francophonie est également un élément qui nous unit, Haïti faisant partie justement des membres fondateurs, et je souhaite que nous puissions encourager la région de manière très concrète, et nous allons nous y employer, les initiatives que vous prenez en ce sens.
Au cours de nos échanges, nous avons convenu de renforcer les liens commerciaux entre les deux pays. La coopération en matière d'éducation à tous les niveaux, surtout l'enseignement supérieur et la formation professionnelle. Vous pouvez compter sur nous. Nous sommes en train de travailler pour que le français, comme nous l'avons si bien dit, qui est notre langue officielle, soit en fait une langue, la langue de la CARICOM aussi. Et nous sommes en train de travailler pour que nos frères de la Martinique et de la Guadeloupe puissent participer aussi dans ce grand mouvement de la CARICOM, parce que la CARICOM, ce sont des pays de la Caraïbe, et je pense que Martinique et Guadeloupe font partie aussi de la CARICOM. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, messieurs, dames.
Okay, so the next few slides, they're all about showing you the impact of this French hegemony in Haiti. The impact is felt at various levels in terms of education. For example, in December 2020, so there's a recent curriculum reform happening in Haiti. And interestingly, that curriculum reform is being funded by the French. Now, what's striking is that in that reform, what you see on this table is that Creole is a language of instruction for the first four grades. And starting in the 5th grade, French becomes the sole language of instruction, with Creole being a language being taught. Now, this is really absurd. It's absurd because it goes back on results that we've had now for the past 5-6 decades, that children learn best in the native language. In this case, most Haitian children speak only Creole. But also that same document, which is produced by both the Ministry of Education in Haiti and by French consultants, that same document recognizes that most teachers are not fluent in French. Even worse yet, that same document recognizes that most students will not be fluent in French until at least the 9th grade. So they're not fluent in French until the 9th grade, but yet they are forced to learn in French starting in the 5th grade. What's even more absurd is that even the teaching of Creole is supposed to happen by using French, because that table tells you that Creole is going to be taught, so they're going to talk about Creole, but yet they're going to do so and they know Creole. They're going to be taught about Creole, the native language, in French, we did not fluent in. So, and this document is an official document. It's been validated now, and it was produced in conjunction by the Haitian government and the French government, by experts in education. So this is just, to me, really an extreme case of hegemony and also neocolonialism. And what you see here is that this also impacts the justice system, where Haitians who speak only Creole, they go to court and they are being tried. So the trial is in French. So everybody in the court speaks Creole, but everything is happening in French. So at the end, the accused might not even know whether they're going to be freed or put in jail until someone tells them in Creole, this is the sentence, And the part that I find galling is that even institutions like UNESCO, which is supposed to, the mandate is to promote diversity of languages. UNESCO was now celebrating this decade of indigenous languages. UNESCO in Haiti functions in French. I could speak about that for hours because I've been trying to push them to do the right thing, and we're making progress. And this is not just UNESCO, it's also the same is true for the World Bank, the same is true for UNICEF, USAID, etc. Okay, so because of time, let's move to a brighter future. And the brighter future goes back to Frantz Fanon, which asks us to understand the roots of the structure. And the roots of the structure is something that linguists have take part in, right? What I called earlier, this regime of truth, this dangerous myth about Creole languages. And we have to really work against this myth. We have to dispel them so that we can create a basis of linguistic equality, which is a precondition for economic and political equity. And this is really what we're doing. So this is now some slides about MIT Haiti, which we've launched in 2010, where we work together with educators in Haiti and abroad at MIT, and we're trying to create a stronger basis for the use of Creole at all levels of the school system, from kindergarten all the way up to university. And I like the meme at the top right corner because it says that our language is our liberation. My t-shirt says, Creole, c'est langue révolution. So it's the same spirit that we need to use our language in order for us to be whole, in order for us to be free. And this is basically the basis of the MIT initiative. So basically the goal is to get rid of the old framework, which is French-based, test-driven, rote learning, and trying to create a basis where Creole can be used for active learning, right? So this is another schema of what we're trying to do. At the bottom, we have these three pillars: the native language, Creole, active learning, and technology, to promote quality education for all. In September of 2019, we launched this platform, which is basically a platform for crowdsourcing of materials in Creole. And my colleague at MIT in mathematics, Heinz Miller, and myself, and what we've done is to invite Haitian teachers who have the political will to help us produce materials at all levels, in all disciplines in Creole. And this stemmed from actually a demand from Haitian teachers saying that, well, MIT, at first when we launched this project, we were producing mostly scientific materials in Creole. But the teachers told us, well, no, we need materials in all fields at all levels because we're focusing on university. And they told us, in order for this movement to succeed, you have to bring in teachers from the very early grade. And so we thought, well, the best way to do it is to create some kind of a open resource, like Wikipedia of sorts, where everyone can participate and produce materials in Creole. And then what we do, we're like curators. We copy edit, we give feedback on three domains: feedback on the language in terms of making sure that the Creole is written according to the rules of the official rules of the language, and we also give feedback in terms of the pedagogy, and also in terms of if we can introduce some use of technology, meaning some actual manipulation of materials and concepts, not just technology in the large sense, not just laptops, but anything that will allow the students to participate in building their own knowledge. That's technology. Okay, so this is a picture from the core team, and the goal, the ultimate goal in terms of linguistics itself is to really heed this recent paper by Charity Hudley, Mallinson, and Buchholz, which is the idea that linguistics, we linguists, we need to basically engage concretely with race and racism. So the goal is to create the basis for inclusion and equity. And the way to do that, we have to think of social impact as a core criterion. And what's important for us, and I say that as I think of the handbook by Tallerman and Gibson, which I take as, in a way, symptomatic of the field, we have to really acknowledge the history of our field in colonialism and conquest. If we don't do that, then we're going to keep repeating those truisms without noticing that, in fact, those truisms, they come from a history of domination. And if we want some criticism that's well-founded, not only on data, but also founded in the history of our field, we need to understand where they're coming from, where these beliefs are coming from. It's difficult because I think, in my own experience, I found linguists to be well-meaning, but often very defensive when it comes to acknowledging this history, which Madison and Hadley and Bushels called, they call it repugnant history. And it is repugnant, but we have to admit it, right? And then there's another issue, which is we need to work on this race gap that really make the field less attractive to scholars of color because of the sort of claims that we make about, say, Creole languages, okay? So, and I believe that, on a more practical side, if you think of the kind of changes that can happen in our field in terms of how we study Creole languages and how we promote them among the public, let's think of this larger picture. The fact that today in the world, some 40% of students are still being miseducated in a foreign language, right? Like in Haiti, for example, most students who speak Creole are being taught in French. And we have to understand, what do linguists contribute to that state of affairs? In the case of Haiti, I've shown you that one reason why, of course, there are complex reasons having to do with power and social class, but one reason is a belief that Creoles are inferior, Creoles are primitive. So my point is that racial prejudice, including discrimination based on language, still keeps a hegemonic knee on the throats of too many of us worldwide, in schools, at work, and in courts. And what I'm inviting you to is to take direct action in our field as educators, and trying to really understand the way in which linguistics can really contribute to equality, to justice, to human rights. It's a tall order, but I think you guys are be ready for it. I love this picture showing the folks that we've been working with for the past, some of the folks, because we've been working with some 250 teachers in Haiti and abroad who want to promote this work. So I love to end with this photo, because our motto is unity makes strength, or in Creole, many hands lighten the load. So I'll close here. Thank you.